Hello, this is Miss Slater, and surprise, more factoring. Let's go through the things we already know. The first day we talked about the rules and how you always should look for the GCF first. You don't have to write this down, by the way, unless you just want it as a review. The second day we talked about counting terms. Actually, this was on the first day as well. Counting terms. So look for two terms. You're going to either have squares or cubes, and then follow those rules. And then for day 2, then we talked about 3 terms, and sometimes you're going to have some easier ones and sometimes you're going to have hard ones. Well, today's lesson is all about having 4 terms, and that's as far as we're going to go, as 4 terms. And there's 2 ways that you can factor, and that's a 2 by 2 or a 3 and 1. This may be the most new for you based off of your previous classes. So let's go ahead and begin. So here we go. If you have 4 terms, you are going to group, and something to be aware of is to be careful when the third term is negative, because you need to include the negative when you're grouping. Always, always, always factor the negative out. Okay, so here is our example. This is going to be grouping 2 by 2. So what I mean by that is you're going to take the first 2 terms and the last 2 terms and find the GCF of both of them. Okay, so this is what it's going to look like. So looking at the first ones, what is in common would be an x. So if I take the GCF out of the first 2, I'd be left with x squared plus 7. And if I have the second 2 to look at here, I would take out a negative 3. And again, that the reminder to yourself, always take that negative out. And if I take out the negative 3 would be left with x squared plus 7. Okay, now the fact that these are a match is a good thing, because those are going to come together as one, and only one set of parentheses. And then the 2 values on the outside are going to come together into one set of parentheses. And that is how you factor by grouping. Okay, so I'll give you some more examples in a little bit, but I want to talk first about a grouping 3 by 1. So when you're trying to group 3 by 1, there's certain things to look for. For example, there are 2 squared terms. That would be a good indication that you're going to have to group by 3 by 1. And one of them is a positive and one of them is a negative. In this case, you've got the x squared and you have the negative p squared. So that is a good indication it's going to be 3 by 1. And then once you look for that and see that, that is the first thing that I would try. The first 3, because of that x, would all go together, and you would factor that just like the trinomials that we've done before. So I'm going to ignore that negative p squared for just a moment and split the x's, split the 1's, and know that it's going to be plus plus for each one of them. Now we know an easier way to write this is x plus 1 squared. Now I'm going to bring this back into the equation here and go ahead and solve. Now I'm hoping that this looks familiar, because this is difference of 2 squares, otherwise known as dots. And just as a refresher, if you had a squared plus b squared, a squared minus b squared, it'd be a's and b's, and then one would be plus and one would be minus. Okay, now just keep that rule in your thoughts when we look at this one, because here is something squared, and this also is something squared with a minus sign in the middle. So we know that there's going to be difference of 2 squares here. So our final answer, we would split the x plus 1's just like we split the a's earlier, and we're going to split the p, and also just like we did in the beginning. And then one's going to be negative and one's going to be positive. And there you have it. There's the factored version of for 3 by 1. Okay, so those are a little more difficult. I'm going to do one more of those in class. I do want you to try it first. 64 minus x squared plus 8x plus 16. This one's a little more obvious because it's showing you what the trinomial is. Okay, so hopefully you've tried it, and now let's go ahead and get to work. 64 we're going to ignore for just a moment, and we're going to split this up into x plus 4 and x plus 4. All that factors nicely. And also, we know that 64 is going to come down the next line, and this, another way to write it is like so. Alright, this again is the place where difference 2 squareds is, and you can see that 64, another way to say that is 8 squared, so that's why we would say that's difference 2 squares. And we'll go ahead and start the parentheses. So the first one splits up into 8 and 8, and the second one you split up into x plus 4 and x plus 4. Okay, and this is where it gets a little tricky. The first part's not so tricky because that's just a plus sign, but the minus sign is attached to both of the x and the 4. So I like to put parentheses in there just as a reminder to myself. So then that would be the first part. This would be the second part. Notice I distributed that negative. So if you look down now at the final answer, there's a little something we can combine together. So you end up with negative, or x plus 12 and negative x plus 4 as your final answer. Okay, so here are two for you to practice, and you can bring to class tomorrow. And go ahead and write these down, and I want you to solve those and be ready to explain in class tomorrow. And finally, you are always required at the very last thing just to make sure that nothing can be factored any further. So always look at your last set of parentheses and see if there's anything else that can be factored out. All right, so that concludes the lesson for today.